Good evening, everyone. My name is Maggie, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual event this evening with Gina Frangello in conversation with Daphne Merkin, discussing Blow Your House Down, a story of family, feminism, and treason. We're so excited and grateful that our bookstore can continue to bring authors and their works to our community during this time. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn about them on our website, booksoup.com, as well as our social media at BookSoup. Our next event is tomorrow, April 13th, with Paul Theroux and Guy Kawasaki discussing Wave at Waimea. To submit a question during the event, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like our speakers to answer, please click the like button. We will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Please do not use the sidebar chat to ask a question. Also, support our bookstore and our authors and purchase a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click the green purchase button that reads Blow Your House Down directly below the viewer screen. The link will redirect you to our website where you can continue your checkout process. We're selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro FM and Kobo for those who are interested. So a little more about Gina. Gina Frangello is the author of Every Kind of Wanting, A Life in Men, Slut Lullabies, and My Sister's Continent. Her short fiction, essays, book reviews, and journalism have been published in Plowshares, the Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, HuffPost, Fence, 5 Chapters, Prairie Schooner, Chicago Reader, and many other publications. A little more about Daphne. Daphne Merkin is the author of the novel 22 Minutes of Unconditional Love and Enchantment, which won the Edward Lewis Walland Award for Best Novel on a Jewish Theme and has just been reissued by Picador. She also published 2 collections of essays, The Fame Lunches and Dreaming of Hitler, as well as a memoir of her struggle with depression, and which was called This Close to Happy. As a former staff writer for The New Yorker, Merkin's cultural criticism frequently appears in the New York Times Book Review and Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, Book Forum, the New York Review of Books, the New Republic, Departures, Elle, Travel and Leisure, Tablet, and many other publications. Merkin has taught at the 92nd Street Y, Marymount Manhattan College, Hunter College, and Columbia University's MFA program. She currently lives in New York City and teaches private writing classes. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Gina and Daphne. Enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie.
Hi, Gina. I can barely see you.
Oh, really? Oh.
You're somehow breaking up.
Yikes.
But I'll imagine you.
I hope others can see me, but
yes,
I am
more clearly
technologically
than I can. Can't be any more technologically challenged than me. Maybe I should just introduce us, although we were just introduced. So we are here to have a conversation about Gina's memoir, which I adored. Kind of raced through it, which I always do when I really like a book. I have to stop myself from finishing it in one night. In its way, in its way, it is a radical story. And in its way, it's a story I think most women would identify, certainly with parts of, that it has places for everyone to enter. And it's also very funny, at times very sad, and I don't know if I'd say it has a triumphant ending, but it has a sort of things do come together. And I was going to add one other thing that I like a lot about the book. I always think people who write memoirs try and make themselves look very good. Do you know what I mean? Like super likable or, whatever. And I always am attracted to memoirs where the writer risks not always being admirable and all those kind of things. But I will cease with my admiration. And Gina, do you want to read first? Tell me what you prefer.
Oh, I don't care, whatever, but thank you for that beautiful introduction.
I thought maybe because it's Gina's book, she should go closer I'll start, in other words.
Yay.
You can forget about my book, and then we'll go to Gina's. So I'm just going to read a tiny bit from this book, from skipping around places. So this is 22 minutes of unconditional love. And this is the opening. In this story, there is no final scene, no decisive change of heart or firm resolve, so much as a furious inner struggle, a struggle that has left no discernible traces, yet has marked me as surely as bruises after a fall. Because there is no end to the hunger for unconditional love, and no end to my belief that he was the one to give it to me. I have no stopwatch to measure how long the experience of sexual pleasure, of losing yourself, lasts at any particular time. It could be 10 minutes or 15 or 22. How do you measure the crest of a wave? All I know is that when it vanishes, it leaves in its wake a devouring appetite for more. To this day, I can't forget how he was always touching me in bed, acting as though my skin came as a surprise. You feel so soft, he said, so smooth. Nothing very original in that, I realized, and yet coming from him, I felt it as a lovely succumbing, a weakening of his ordinary resistance. Then there is this. I am a writer, a believer in the powers of art to shape experience, so that others might recognize something of themselves in it. Except when it comes to my own life, it appears. I have decided to tell this story now, after all these years, as a way of forcing it to the finish line. I am still confused about how I got to that place to begin with, and how I got out without going mad, howling like a wolf. I think it had something to do, despite all evidence to the contrary, with some intact shred of a life force. I willed him out of my life in order to pursue a more sane existence, one that would include a husband and children, a daughter I would bring up to feel full in herself, without vast absences or ravaging needs. But it was just that, an effort of will rather than a natural ending, only a sense that if I wanted to survive, I would have to move on. Meanwhile, the efficient little clock on my desk keeps marking the passage of time. If you pick up this clock, a practically weightless black brawn traveling clock with white hour and minute hands and a yellow second hand, and hold it close to your ear, you can hear a faint, even tick. So many days, months, and years have intervened, not to mention a marriage, the daughter I wished for, and another child on the way. You'd think he'd have no place in my thoughts anymore. And for periods of time, he doesn't, only to alight on my nerve endings once again. It has to do, I imagine, with the tedium, the worn routines that are an inescapable part of domestic life. Some habit of my husband's that I have tired of, such as the way he blinks his eyes rapidly when someone disagrees with him, or the way my daughter puts up an argument about something perfectly reasonable, like getting into her pajamas before bedtime. Suddenly a space opens up, a wedge of restlessness mixed with longing, and Howard Rose walks back in. I'm going to just read one other paragraph, which is sort of explaining that in these obsessions, the man doesn't really matter. It's sort of, in these kinds of love-struck stories, the man in question is never really interesting. No one found Howard Rose interesting. No one, that is, but me. I'm not sure I found him interesting either, not in any clear sense, so much as a reminder of where I emotionally began and would always remain, no matter how hard I tried to move away. Dazzled by intermittency, by the light beaming on and then off, a glimpse of absolute happiness, followed by nothing but the lonely darkness. The allure of remoteness, affection edged in ice and always on the verge of melting away, of disappearing entirely, suggesting a greater possibility of being converted into love than all the tender kisses in the world. To me, then, he was someone I had tried to win over long ago and had succeeded for a while, only to fail in the end, or more exactly, only to realize that what I longed for would eventually leave me in tatters. He was my mother, I suppose, with bits and pieces of my father thrown in, but to what extent that clarifies matters is anyone's guess. How everything conspires to keep us in the dark about ourselves.
I seriously I've loved Daphne's work since I was in my 20s, and I now would like to promptly interrogate her about that book because I love the book.
Thank you.
But so I will.
But we're here to interrogate you.
I will go forth to read a bit of Blow Your House Down. I'm reading from a section called Embers. So a lot of things happen in Blow Your House Down. There's caregiving my elderly parents. There's the death of my best friend there, and there is also an extramarital affair that is on and off again for a period of over 3 years. And Embers takes place when the affair has ended, but is about to start up again, etc. And the quote that begins it is, "This is a work of fiction. No person in it bears any resemblance to any actual person, living or dead, etc., etc. London does not exist." And that's Graham Greene. My lover lay on a dirty mattress on the floor, naked, of course. His desert cabin was already scorching in April, swamp cooler not quite working, everything covered in a fine layer of dust that swept without mercy through the rickety windows. The picturesque potbelly stove aside, a snuff film would not have looked out of place at that cabin. Sweat made grit cling to his bare skin while I kept in motion, clean but from my knees when I'd straddled his face, tightened my thighs around his head until he gasped for air while I came. How we had waited for this day. Our affair was less than 2 months old. 4 days together in California, so far from my real life, seemed a miracle that might never recur. How we'd rhapsodized, how we'd plotted, how we'd planned. I wore my Nana's vintage garter belt that had never fit my mother, passed right to me. My fishnets were torn, the boots he'd been licking had dried and bore no trace of him on their smooth Italian leather. I'd be wearing them later to a party in LA, and already I understood that voltage would run through my body every time I thought of this afternoon, of his tongue, his mouth. I had never burned a man before. I had never fucked a man's mouth with the heel of my boot before. I had never clipped a wrist cuff to a thigh cuff before. I had never used a violet wand before. I had never known intimacy so beyond the domain of ego or language before. And his hand, just below his knuckles where I'd marked him, still sparked embers. Nothing but raw, open flesh yet. Still, we had been prematurely referring to it as our scar all day. My heels clicked across dusty tiles before I scoured his bag for the unopened American Spirit pack strewn among the cups, crop, metal clips. I lit one and brought it back to the mattress to share. I'd forgotten to untie him. There was no place to rest the smoke, so I simply held it to his mouth and let him drag. He had once gone 11 years without smoking, but he sucked in hungrily, exhaled as I brought the taste of him to my lips. He said, "I really shouldn't be doing this," and we laughed until we were snorting. "You meant the cigarette, right? What else could you possibly mean?" He'd reopened the scar before I saw him again 4 months later, after I'd already ended our affair. I never got to see it in its original state, whole. "I want it bigger," he explained, my dark Chicago gangway, my husband upstairs and his wife in the basement just below our feet, waiting for him. We'd planned this visit when the affair was still in full bloom, as a kind of proof to ourselves that we could be, quote, very strange best friends and not let it impact our marriages, our roles in an overlapping literary community. But that was all over now. Since I'd ended it, my lover had grown obsessed with the schedule of when my husband and I had sex, begging me to email him when it was over so he could stop picturing it in his mind and relax into about a week's reprieve before it would transpire again. He looked thin, hollowed out, as he showed me his handiwork on the scar. "It's all I have left of you," he whispered in the gangway, illuminated by my neighbor's sensor lights that reminded me we couldn't hide anything anymore. "I hope you don't mind." I thought of his feral beauty while my heels slid in and out of his mouth, that cabin, the way he'd smiled when I blew on his flesh like coals to keep the burn stoked, his zen-like meditative purr. He never even flinched. In those moments, he was perfectly content. How could I complain about his wanting our scar to be more prominent? If anything, I was envious not to have my own permanent marking, my own imprint of our short history on my skin. Besides, I already knew that much about him. In between our widely spaced out transcendent moments, he always wanted more. So then I'm skipping to the very end of this piece, after things have gone off the rails. There should be more to show for us than a star I burned into his hand, though. There was so much more to what we were than the heel of my fucking boot in his mouth. But things look one way if you stay forever, and they look a whole other color if you are the one to go. I remember the way he dropped asleep in my arms every single time we shared a bed, as though he had never had insomnia in his life. I remember how we used to laugh until our bodies convulsed, like the bad kids in the back of a classroom. I remember the way he could recite entire passages of Fitzgerald, and how the night we drove back from his cabin to Los Angeles, still sweaty and gritty under our regular street clothes, the hot wind blowing into my already wild hair, I felt alive to every molecule, the heights and depths of every sensation I had ever known. I remember the way he made filling my car up with gas fun even in February in Chicago. I remember love like we invented it. I would beg you to find a way to love me even though I've walked away, but I know you do and that hurts more. So instead I'm begging you to find a way to forget me, I wrote to him, for magnanimity, trying to act like someone who wanted to be erased, except for people who truly desire erasure, do not usually dole out advice about how to best forget them. Besides, like getting off the phone with me without saying I love you, like leaving a stray cat unfed in the yard, like ever eating Brussels sprouts again after his puke incident when he was 6, forgetting was simply not in his range of options. In Santa Cruz in October, we walked the pier at dawn, stood listening to the sea lions barking. The marine layer was thick, the air cool, and soon the sun would break through and the mist evaporate fast. It had been 6 months since we touched. It would be some 5 months before we were scheduled to be in the same city again later in the winter for a conference. A friend's wife seeing us that weekend together at events in San Francisco and Santa Cruz, events at which we knew so many other people we had deemed it safe to both attend, had said to her husband, "Are they a couple?" And later he would tell us that he had answered, "I have no idea whether they're fucking, but they're clearly a couple, yeah." But I had never seen a sea lion before. I had never felt the texture of a man's toes in my mouth before. I had never licked a man's tears before. I had never felt the fragile pulse of my body's existence insist upon its will so primally before, reducing all of who I thought I was to an exposed wire of desire. Our leather jackets crackled together when we walked the pier arm in arm. He came in with me to buy souvenirs for my daughter, and when the merchant didn't take credit cards and I had to borrow cash, he joked that the gifts were tainted by blood money. Afterwards, though I never told him, I threw the small wrap boxes away and bought them something else, though I'd already paid him back. It was a slip, I told myself on the plane home from San Francisco. A slip, not a relapse. 5 months still until the next time we would see each other. Before driving to the airport, we wept into each other's hair in my cheap motel like long ago lovers boarding ships for opposite shores in a day before postal systems, telephones, computers. At least we got to say goodbye in person this time, I told him, and believed I meant it. In 5 months, I would be stronger. In 5 months, I would be better. This time, I would not err. This time, I would last. That day at the cabin, though, the embers of us still sparking in the skin across my lover's veins, he'd exhaled smoke and said, "I really shouldn't be doing this." And we'd laughed because so few things feel as good as to be beyond one's own control, because I'd spent my entire life believing that with pain came darkness, that with unconventional desires came shame. But between us, there was none of that nonsense, no role-playing or repetition compulsion of old wounds, no embarrassment or hackneyed artifice, only this bottomless sense of adventure, the body our Mount Everest to climb while learning to breathe a different air, our intimacy a place of joyful safety and trust that made me question everything I ever understood regarding how to be normal, how to be good. And we laughed to keep from crying because he was right.
I was thinking as you were reading, Gina, and when I was reading the book, how to me the memoir is almost in a way suspenseful. in spite of its interiority, which I like both sides, because you're in the end rooting, I think, for the love affair to work out. But given all your, pulls to stay in the marriage, not stay in the marriage, your husband saying first, stay in the marriage, let's work it out. And then I wasn't sure till the very end, as you lay it out, that they would stay together, much less get married. I thought they would stay together and it would last 3 minutes when they were unimpeded. Impediments always helping romance. So in that way, the book kind of certainly keeps you with you. And what I was going to ask you first, listening, I thought, even though I've written fairly candidly myself, did you feel any risk with writing so candidly in terms of, I'm going to ask some like obvious people, because when I've taught writing classes, that always comes up as an issue. Like, how can you write about your mother if your mother's alive, or your ex-boyfriend? Did you feel anxious at all or worried about your children reading it, your memoir, or your ex-husband? I was interested.
I felt anxiety about everything.
Right.
It is basically the reality. But what you said early on, in terms of portraying myself in ways that are not always sympathetic, was very important to me in the writing of this book. And it's not to say that that everyone who has an affair is necessarily unsympathetic, etc. But I felt it was important to show myself in a really wide spectrum of moments, and I wanted the reader to feel the suspense with me as I had gone through with it, because I think, first of all, so the beginning of this takes place, the beginning of that section I just read took place 2 months into the affair, and it was a long distance affair. So 2 months could mean, 4 days into the affair, because we didn't see each other very often. And I think that I, like very many people, assumed that these affairs that burn very brightly with this sort of sexual intensity, that they blow over, that they'll fade out, they'll end badly. Some, the desire will fade. And I felt a lot of suspense throughout the events that I depict, right? So at one point, I thought that I was going to end the book after the death of my father, which was after I had admitted the affair to my ex-husband. And so we had split. We were living apart. But my then lover, now husband, had not yet moved to Chicago, was in the middle of a pretty profound depression. Things were not exactly, going swimmingly. And my divorce was complex. My pull to stay in the marriage for various reasons were very complex. And my dad had just died. And I sort of wanted to end it there. I wanted to leave myself on a cliff. And then so many other things happened, including my getting breast cancer and just a whole variety of other things that seemed to me connected to the book because of bodies, because of the sexual erasure of people who have been sick and of older women and all of these different things, and the treatment in the medical industrial complex. I could go on and on about that, but I decided to take it further. And one of the sort of costs, I guess, of taking it further was that the romantic entanglement between my then lover, now husband, and I became more resolved. We don't get married in the book, but we're engaged by the end of the book. And but to sort of go back to your original question, this was originally in a different version, a short story. It was a piece of fiction. And I really, really, really wrestled whether to revise it and turn it into like a chapter in this book. I wondered whether I needed to, I wondered whether I needed to show those moments. But in the end, I felt as though I wanted the reader to know me. I wanted the reader to know both of us. And I felt that, particularly for me, and for women in general, sexual psychology, the way that it sometimes is tied to sort of like past demons, but also the way that it can simultaneously be liberating and like promote agency, that the complexity of that, and like, you know, and the moral complexity of that, and the possible judgments of people who are like, what are they doing? I don't like that, you know. I just wanted to invite it all. I wanted it all in the book, and I wanted people to see the messiness. So yeah.
I wondered, well, I think one of the things is that, interesting you said see the messiness, because I like a certain quality the book has of like opening up in like waves as you read it. Like I kept thinking, how did you, to use, you know, a basic term, like how did you structure it? Because in some ways it seems, I guess the word would be organic, like you move from, but there are obviously, the book is also artistically controlled. How did you decide, or is this too general a question, but it always interests me, were there many things in it that you took out by the end? Were there ways that like surprised you where you were going? I was particularly
Yeah.
interested with this book.
Yeah. I mean, so the book has, it has a lot of formal divergences. So, I mean, not every chapter is told in the same way. Many moons ago, I read Book of Daniel by E.L. Doctorow, and I remember just the top of my head kind of blowing off and being like, oh, a fictitious first person narrator can suddenly start talking about himself in the second or third person, or can propose three different endings and not let us quite know which one it is. And so that has always stayed with me. And I think memoirs like Maxine Hung Kingston's The Woman Warrior, where so much of the book, I mean, she includes ghost stories and shamans and things that may or may not have happened to relatives she doesn't even know if they really existed in China, but it's all filtered through her lens. And what does that mean for her own self-discovery? And so I wanted the book to kind of mirror the way your life just doesn't run along a smooth line. So, for example, a lot of the sections about my parents, and my parents are very, very present in the book. They're really prominent characters in the book. They lived downstairs from me for many years while I was raising my kids. And they were both just eccentric as hell, particularly my father, and really funny people. And in those sections where my parents are in there, the narrative tends to be more linear. It tends to be
Right.
more of a traditional narrative. And, you know, then other parts, much less so. There's a section that is written in the form of a dictionary. It's called a dictionary, a short dictionary of mutually understood words. It's borrowed from Kundera, and I loved on the back of your novel that you were compared to Kundera, you know, because I have always been obsessed with his work in terms of just like the sexual psychology. But he has that section in Unbearable Lightness of Being where it's a short dictionary of misunderstood words between Sabina and Franz, her lover. And so in that chapter, I, by contrast, do a direct address to my then lover, essentially interrogating the various words that have loaded meanings in our affair and kind of why things are at that moment not working out. And, you know, despite all this passion and intensity that we had, and despite the affair having gone on for a long time and having been friends beforehand, the first section is called Story of A, and it's just a list of A words that have to do with the treatment of adultery in literature and in law and, you know, across disciplines and so forth. So I think I tried to make form mirror content. And when the form is more linear, more traditional, kind of more, you know, just straight, that part of my life was a part of my life I'd been living for a long time and that I thought I could make sense of. And then other times things just did not open themselves up quite to traditional narrative,
Right.
and worked best in these sort of in these formally different fragments. And so for me, the idea was, how will they all interact and turn into a whole? And I will definitely thank my editor, Dan Smetanka, over at Counterpoint, for really helping guide me with that, because you know, I wanted to show the messy collisions of a middle-aged woman's life that is going off the rails. But because that involves so many different things, you know, cancer and dead parents and dead friends and caregiving and 3 kids and an affair, and then trying to turn something from an affair bubble to an on-the-ground relationship, it was, you know, it wasn't, the challenge was how to turn it all into one coherent arc. And I ended up deciding that in order to do that, I didn't have to tell every chapter the same way. And I'll give a shout out to Claire Dederer's Love and Trouble. I was very influenced by that book in its way of telling one cohesive narrative, but, you know, there's like a letter to Roman Polanski in there, and there's, you know, so there's all these different forms. And so I really was very inspired by people who had gone before me and had pushed the bounds of memoir and how it should be told. So yeah, that was a challenge. It was a challenge, but it was also fun. It was also great to deal with every transition, and then this happened, you know, and to just be able to, like, you know, switch.
Yeah. No, I think that's hard to do. So I admired that it was done successfully, because a little bit when you do that, you're on what's it called? When you're not a trapeze, you know, when you walk,
you're on a tightrope. Definitely. Definitely.
You know, you either do it in a way that keeps the reader, which I think you do it, or you lose the reader sooner or later. You know, the reader could say, wait, this doesn't all make sense. It doesn't all cohere. But there's a line a string that you keep through the book that allows, I think, the reader, even with the very different styles that you use, to follow. One of the, I think, achievements is that you made, maybe, I hope this is what you meant, you make the husband both interesting, even though she finds him not interesting, ultimately. He's not really demonized.
Yeah.
Maybe you think he was demonized, so I hope
I don't think that he was, no. It certainly was not my intention to demonize.
No.
You know, we were married for 23 years, almost. We were together for 25 years. You know, you don't spend that kind of time with someone and, you know, live through miscarriage, live through, you know, his mother's death, all these, raise 3 children together and walk away being like, I'd like to make someone a caricature who everyone who reads this book will hate. I mean, that was very, very far from my hope. And thankfully, you know, I had written characters before in my fiction where the female protagonist is very agitated by the male character and, you know, no longer wanting to be in the relationship with the male character, but where many readers might be like, that guy's right, you know, like, and I love that. I love that complexity. You know, I did not want the reader to emerge from the book thinking like, oh, well, I guess she wasted a quarter century of her life with this terrible person. Like, because that's not real. That's not reality. You know, sometimes you just, you know, you marry young, you change, and things, you know, things change. But I
Right.
think that everybody is complex, and I'm not interested in caricatures in either fiction or nonfiction.
Yeah. But I guess in that way, the book is wonderfully unself-justifying. First of all, you have enough guilt to cover the planet, and you describe
Sad
your
but
guilt.
true.
You describe your guilt about what is this doing to your children. It's very well done. And guilt toward your husband, guilt about your father not knowing the truth that you have had a love affair, right? Your father doesn't know before he
No, he
dies.
never knows. He dies
Right.
without.
Maybe I found that I did find it unusual the degree to which the man that is left, you also give reasons why you left him, why you wanted the marriage over. I mean, he sounds like he flew into rages. And I never knew how much the writer in you he gave your ex-husband. I couldn't tell. Did he give that space, appreciation? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't talk a lot about my writing
No,
in
you
the
don't.
book because, you know, I think some writers can really get away with that and be like, and I'm a writer and here's all these things about my career as but, you know, but generally speaking, it can really be annoying both to other writers and
Right.
to non-writers, very self-referential. You know, my ex-husband was very supportive of my literary career. My current husband is a writer, so he obviously also is very supportive. I know many, many, many women who have not been supported in their writing, who have been, you know, mocked, who have been discouraged, whose partners get angry every time they read anything that they write. I was never in that situation. I was always very lucky in that way.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting you say that because I've just been watching the Ernest Hemingway series.
Oh, I haven't seen it yet. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I personally have never liked her. I mean, I think Hemingway at his best did write supremely well, but a lot is not his best. And he always seemed like an enormous bully. And in fact, on this very issue of writing, when he was married to a writer, to Martha Gellhorn, he eventually starts attacking her writing. They don't get along. She, even though they had a very romantic beginning, she stands up to him and he says something about no one's interested in your writing or some complete dismissal. And when you decided to leave details out, this may sound reductive, but how come you never actually say what your ex-husband does? It's left vague.
I very much, I mean, so neither my lover nor my ex-husband have a name in the piece. 3 children all have, you know, pseudonyms. You know, I tried to include the absolute bare minimum. You know, I've given this analogy, so, you know, forgive me to anyone in the audience who's, you know, been to any of my other events, but it's like, memoir is thought to be this, like, I cut my skin open and I step out, right? And it's like, I do include a lot in this memoir that perhaps certain writers wouldn't have included. But to me, I was including the bare minimum in terms of details about other people that could tell my story. And so I was not very interested either ethically or aesthetically in having to go into enormous depth about other characters and their lives, you know, if that makes sense.
It does. not to sound like Barbara Walters, but do you think your ex-husband is going to read the book? Or do you think he will?
I have no idea.
Yeah. He can't. I sort of was reading it and thought, he will. Because I think people who are married, were married to writers, are in the end fascinated by the ability to spin art out of what is often the mess of life. So that's my intuition. But how long, if I may ask these simple, how long did it take you to write the book?
Oh God, a million years.
Right.
So some of these pieces had been published in other forms, in, on the Nervous Breakdown, on Psychology Today, places like that, in essay form. And usually the ones about my parents. But obviously, of course, this piece, Embers, that I just read, was originally in an anthology, fictionalized. In fact, it was an anthology where you replied to a graphic piece of art, like not graphic as in sexually graphic, like you replied to graphic art by writing a story, and then
Right.
your story was replied to by a graphic artist. So it's a triptych.
Oh.
So that was really fun. And obviously, so, I was responding to a piece. And so it wasn't, it didn't strike me at first how much was autobiographical that I was putting in there. And so, that transformation happened. But, some of these pieces, were published in around 2011 or so, like in the early days of my parents' illness. A lot of it was written before my parents were dead. And some of it was written before I was having an affair.
Right.
I mean, the Death's Monkey Sphere, was originally published. I mean, the affair had not yet begun at that point. So it took a while. I mean, it was a book that was, nearly a decade in the making. And at that point, that I sort of accepted that it was going to be a book and not just a bunch of disparate essays, some of which I hid in my drawer for all eternity. I found myself unable to write fiction. And so for me, it was sort of like this was the wall of fire I had to get through in hopes of being able to not only write fiction again, but also, I think, to move beyond certain central obsessions that I had been circling in my fiction that I now understand in ways I did not understand at the time. Were almost kind of like a psychological roadmap to things that I wasn't yet accepting about myself and about my life.
A character who I find very, well, poignant is one word, but more than poignant. She has sort of more, she's also in her way stoic, is your mother. I keep thinking of the moment when she cracks her head. Doesn't she fall? Oh,
She
no,
does.
a car, something.
She's in a car crash, although she also once, I don't think it's in the book, but it was in an essay of mine. Once she called the paramedics to come get my father because he was having a medical emergency. And in letting them in the door, she tripped over the threshold and cracked her head and broke her neck on the front porch, and the paramedics took both of them away. Like, this was just a typical day in the house. Like, she had so many medical mishaps. I mean, she had like something like 17 or 19 surgeries in a very short period of time by the time of her death. Yeah.
I don't remember this. I'm sorry. Since I just read it, it speaks to my geriatric memory. Does your mother die in the book? No.
She dies at the end, and I'll tell you what, she had not yet died when I sold the book.
Right.
And the final chapter, called The Cartographer's 50 Meditations, which is told in 50 parts and is told the year that I am 50.
Now I'm
I'm
remembering.
now 52, so that was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
I had to add that in. My mother died when I was 50, and it was not a it was not an original part of the book, and it's now very difficult for me to imagine the book having existed without her death, because I think that one of the things about the book is the way that my father, who really was a very kind and gentle person, but he was very high maintenance. He his existence was a lot of noise in our
Right.
family, right? Because he had a lot of, both mental and physical problems. And but in the end, I mean, my mom was, just kind of the guiding star of my life, and much of my dialogue about whether I was a bad woman, a bad mother, a bad wife, versus whether I was, liberating myself, allowing myself to be a real human being, following my own desires, was an internal debate that will probably rage till I die, largely about the way my choices differed from the choices my mother made. I mean, my mother stayed in a very long marriage, that, with a good man, but who didn't make her happy. And,
Right. You make the
and,
marriage sound so ungratifying. Their marriage.
I think that they came around, as many people do in their old age, to a very different kind of intimacy. But my parents, no, did not have a gratifying marriage from my mother's to my mother, psychologically or sexually. And she felt extremely obligated to I mean, she loved my father, I mean, who doesn't love the person that they're married to, regardless of like what they may wish for themselves? She loved my father, and she chose ultimately to sort of sacrifice her own happiness on the altar of family. And there was heroism in that, and there was tragedy in that.
True. I was going to say, but I can't, I will say it, that I think this is a very brave book, which I mean completely as a compliment, although I have an ex-agent who said to me, when they say you're brave, they mean you're crazy. And it's always stayed with me. Like, really? But I think you take risks in the book with how you characterize yourself for the reader. The reader has to either ultimately accept you, like in a way, it's very close to life. I mean, in the end, people you're close to, you know all their flaws, but you accept them anyway.
Yes.
And that way you don't hide your flaws. But I felt that, anyway, I truly admired the book. I think it really has a very wide scope.
Thank you.
Do you, Gina, want to take some questions?
Sure.
They're supposed to be here, are they?
I don't know. I don't know if I can see them.
Yeah, I think maybe no one did ask a question. It says ask a question. No one has any questions?
Oh, here's Maggie to help us. Wait, you're muted, Maggie. Wait, she's muted, right?
Yes.
I don't know what to do about that.
Right. Maybe I'll just write.
Can you hear us, Maggie? You're muted.
Hi.
Oh, now you.
Oh,
now
hi.
You.
Hi.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Your presentation was very thorough. Maybe people don't have questions because they've all been answered.
Right.
That's the usual case with these things. So do you have any final remarks about the book?
just would like to thank Book Soup for hosting me. Book Soup has always been really amazing to me. I've had a number of events there. In fact, I met my now husband for the first time ever at Book Soup at an event. And thank you, Daphne, because we all have a million things to do in this pandemic, and like the world is always burning, and I really appreciate your time and the support of the bookstore. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And everyone who came.
I think you should all, men, women, go out and buy this book. I mean, I think it's I don't want to sound like a circus barker, but I think it raises a lot of questions. You do that very well about what do we live for? What is this? And doesn't answer all of them, which I also liked. It leaves certain things open, but I'm a huge fan.
Thank you so much. It's mutual. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's a wrap on our presentation. Thank you again to our guests and for all of you who tuned in this evening. We're greatly appreciative of everyone's time and your support of independent bookstores. Please support our bookstore and our authors by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click on the green purchase button that reads "Blow Your House Down" directly below the viewer screen. If you'd like regular updates on our upcoming events, make sure to follow us on Crowdcast and subscribe to our newsletter. Have a great evening, everyone, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.